June 1941. A single Soviet tank sits motionless at a crossroads in Lithuania. German Panzer crews fire round after round. 37mm shells, 50mm armor-piercing rounds, all ricochet into the dirt. Radio chatter turns frantic. Our weapons are useless. The KV-1 wasn't supposed to exist like this. One engineer's rejected armor scheme, dismissed as too heavy, too radical, had just made this steel beast nearly invincible. And the Germans were about to learn what terror on tracks really meant. This wasn't luck. It wasn't superior numbers. It was one man refusing to compromise on an idea everyone else had abandoned. Before we step deeper into this tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Which corner of the world are you in? Share it in the comments. And now, let's begin our journey. Late 1938. The Kirov Plant in Leningrad hums with urgency. Stalin has issued a directive that cannot be ignored. The Red Army needs a breakthrough tank. Not another light reconnaissance machine. Not a medium tank with adequate protection. Something that can punch through fortified lines, absorb punishment, and keep moving when everything else burns. The existing designs are already obsolete, and everyone in the design bureau knows it. The Spanish Civil War has shown what modern anti-tank guns can do. The clashes with Japan at Khalkhin Gol have exposed how vulnerable Soviet armor truly is. Engineer Kotin stands in a workshop surrounded by blueprints and steel plate samples, facing a problem that has no easy answer. How do you create a tank that can withstand the coming storm without becoming so heavy it cannot move? Traditional armor layouts are a patchwork of compromises. Plates bolted together leave seams. Turret rings create weak points. Driver hatches become death traps. Hull joints crack under stress. Every angle, every hatch, every rivet is a place where a shell might find its way through. Kotin has studied every tank design the Soviets have captured, borrowed, or stolen. He has read reports from Spain, from Finland, from the border skirmishes in the east. The conclusion is inescapable. Incremental improvements will not be enough. What is needed is not a better tank. What is needed is a different kind of tank entirely. He proposes something that makes his colleagues uneasy. Welded construction instead of rivets. Armor plates so thick they seem excessive. Angles calculated not just for deflection but for maximum resistance at every conceivable impact point. 75mm of steel on the front hull. Sloped surfaces where possible. A design philosophy that prioritizes protection above almost everything else. The weight projections are staggering. 40 tons, perhaps more. The suspension systems available can barely handle 30. The engines will strain. The transmissions will scream under the load. His superiors look at the numbers and shake their heads. Too heavy, they say. It will break down before it reaches the battlefield. It will sink into mud. It will crush bridges. It is impractical. But Kotin does not back down. He argues with a quiet intensity that unsettles the bureaucrats. War is not a question of convenience, he insists. War is a question of survival. A tank that can be destroyed is a steel coffin. A tank that cannot be penetrated is a moving fortress. Speed means nothing if you burn before you reach the enemy. Mobility means nothing if a single hit kills your crew. He speaks of the German panzers massing on the border, of the certainty that they will come, of the need to have something, anything, that can stand against them when that day arrives. The room is silent. No one wants to be the person who blocked a project Stalin himself has demanded. No one wants to be responsible if the engineer is right, and they are wrong. Desperation creates space where caution would not. The Spanish War has ended badly. The Winter War with Finland is a humiliation, exposing every weakness in Soviet armor and doctrine. Tanks burn too easily. Crews die too quickly. The Red Army is expanding faster than it can train or equip its soldiers, and the leadership knows that quantity alone will not save them. They need a symbol. They need a breakthrough. They need something the enemy will fear. Kotin's design is approved, not because everyone believes in it, but because no one has a better idea. The prototype is authorized. The workshops begin cutting steel. The engineers start solving problems no one has faced before. How do you weld plates this thick without warping them? How do you mount a gun heavy enough to matter without overloading the turret? How do you keep the crew alive inside a metal box that will draw every enemy shell on the battlefield? The work is brutal. Welders labor in shifts, their torches throwing shadows across the factory floor. Metallurgists test steel samples until they crack. Suspension designers reinforce bogies and tracks, knowing they are pushing the limits of what the components can endure. There are no foreign blueprints to copy this time, no captured tanks to reverse engineer. This is Soviet engineering at its rawest. Improvisation, determination, and the knowledge that failure is not an option. Kotin moves between workstations, checking measurements, approving changes, rejecting shortcuts. He sleeps in the plant some nights. He eats at his desk. He does not speak of doubt, even when the prototype's weight climbs past 43 tons and the transmission fails during the first test drive. By late 1939, the machine is ready. It does not look like other tanks. It looks heavier, squatter, more brutal. The armor is a single welded shell, not a collection of bolted plates. The gun is a 76mm cannon, larger than anything mounted on a Soviet tank before. The crew compartment is cramped, the visibility poor, the controls stiff and unforgiving. But when the first test firing is conducted, when armor-piercing rounds are shot at the hull from standard combat ranges, something extraordinary happens. The shells do not penetrate. They do not even crack the welds. They strike the angled plates and ricochet into the dirt, leaving only scars on the surface. The observers stand in silence, watching the impacts, watching the tank sit motionless and undamaged. One engineer whispers what everyone is thinking: we have built something new. The proving grounds outside Leningrad. Winter 1939. Snow crunches under 43 tons of steel as the KV-1 prototype rumbles forward. Exhaust smoke trailing black against white sky. Engineers huddle in greatcoats, clipboards clutched in frozen fingers, watching this machine that shouldn't exist navigate obstacles that would trap lighter tanks. The prototype climbs embankments, crushes through timber barriers, pivots on terrain that would snap the suspension of anything else in the Soviet arsenal. But it's not the mobility tests that matter today. Today, they will try to kill it. Artillery pieces are positioned at measured distances. 37mm anti-tank guns, the standard German weapon encountered in Spain. 45mm Soviet guns, proven against most armor. Even a captured Czech 47mm piece, rumored effective against French tanks. Kotin stands apart from the observers, arms crossed, face unreadable. He has calculated the angles, verified the welds, tested the steel composition until the numbers blurred. But numbers on paper and reality under fire are different languages. If the armor fails now, his career ends here. If it holds, everything changes. The first shot cracks across the frozen field. A 37mm round strikes the frontal glacis at optimal angle. The impact rings like a cathedral bell. The shell caroms skyward, tumbling end over end before burying itself in a snowbank 30 meters away. No penetration, not even a significant dent. The gunners reload. Fire again. Same result. They adjust range, try different impact points. Turret front, hull side at angle, gun mantlet. Every round deflects or shatters against welded steel that refuses to yield. An observer mutters a prayer. Another scribbles frantically, unable to believe his measurements. They move to the 45mm gun. Heavier, more powerful, capable of defeating any tank the Soviets currently field. The crew loads armor-piercing ammunition, aims carefully at the turret ring, traditionally a weak point where rotating mechanisms create gaps. The gun barks. The KV-1 rocks slightly from impact energy. When the smoke clears, there's a bright scar on the armor. Metal compressed and scorched, but no breach. The turret still rotates smoothly. Kotin's expression doesn't change, but his shoulders drop half an inch. He has been holding his breath. Test after test. They fire until gun barrels heat and ammunition runs low. They strike the same spots repeatedly, hoping to crack welds or create cumulative damage. The armor absorbs punishment that would reduce other tanks to burning wrecks. Only at point-blank range, with the heaviest guns at perfect 90-degree impact, do rounds occasionally penetrate, and even then, not reliably. At combat distances, with realistic angles, the KV-1 is effectively immune to every anti-tank weapon Germany deployed in Poland. The observers know what this means. So does Kotin. They have created something the enemy cannot kill. But invincibility comes with a price. During extended trials, the transmission overheats after 6 hours of operation. Gear teeth crack under the strain of moving such mass. The engine, a modified version of a diesel aircraft design, consumes fuel at alarming rates and requires constant maintenance. Visibility from inside is abysmal. The driver peers through a narrow slit. The commander struggles to coordinate crew through cramped interior space. The turret traverse is manual, requiring 2 men straining at handwheels to rotate the gun. In combat, this sluggishness could be fatal. The tank can survive hits, but can it fight effectively? Crews selected for training climb inside and immediately complain. The interior is a maze of sharp edges and awkward angles, every surface cold enough to freeze skin on contact. Ammunition storage is poorly positioned. Loading the gun requires contortions. The radio, when it works, is nearly inaudible over engine roar. Drivers report that steering requires physical strength beyond most soldiers, that the clutch mechanism fights every gear change, that forward visibility is so limited they navigate half-blind. One commander emerges after 4 hours inside and vomits from diesel fumes and motion sickness. These are not tanks, the crews mutter. These are iron coffins that happen to move. Kotin listens to every complaint, notes every failure, but refuses to compromise the armor. Transmissions can be strengthened, engines can be improved, crews can be trained to endure discomfort. But if the armor fails, if shells penetrate, none of the other problems matter because the crew will be dead. He pushes the design forward with the same stubborn intensity that birthed it, demanding solutions that don't reduce protection. Engineers work through nights, redesigning components around the immovable core of Kotin's armor scheme. The tank will be difficult. It will be uncomfortable, but it will not burn. February 1940. The winter war against Finland exposes Soviet armor as tragically vulnerable. Light tanks brew up from single anti-tank rifle shots. Medium tanks are destroyed by Molotov cocktails and satchel charges. Crews burn alive in machines that were supposed to protect them. The losses are staggering, humiliating. Stalin demands answers. Heads roll, and suddenly Kotin's heavy, uncomfortable, mechanically troubled fortress on tracks doesn't seem so impractical anymore. The objections about weight and complexity evaporate in the face of burning T-26s and BT-7s littering Finnish snowfields. Survival, it turns out, matters more than convenience. Production authorization comes in March. The Kirov Plant receives orders to manufacture the KV-1 in quantity, despite unresolved mechanical issues, despite crew complaints, despite every rational argument against rushing an experimental design into mass production. War is coming. Everyone knows it. The Spanish Civil War was a rehearsal. Poland was an overture. The real performance approaches, and the Soviet Union needs tanks that won't die in the opening act. Kotin's rejected idea, his radical armor scheme dismissed as too heavy and too extreme, becomes official doctrine. Workers flood the production lines. Welders train in techniques never before used at scale. The KV-1 transitions from prototype curiosity to desperate necessity. By June 1941, over 600 KV-1s are scattered across Soviet mechanized corps. Most crews have minimal training, a few days familiarizing themselves with controls, perhaps one live fire exercise if ammunition was available. Maintenance personnel barely understand the complex transmission. Spare parts are scarce. Doctrine for employing such heavy tanks doesn't exist. They are distributed like any other armor, mixed into units designed around lighter, faster machines. No one truly knows how to use them. No one understands what they have been given. And then, on June 22nd, Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, and the KV-1 goes from experimental question mark to the answer no one knew they needed. June 22nd, 1941. 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border at dawn. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, tears through frontier defenses like paper. Panzer divisions race forward, encircling entire Soviet armies before they can react. Luftwaffe bombers obliterate airfields still lined with parked aircraft. In 72 hours, the Red Army loses more men and machines than most nations possess. German commanders report progress exceeding even their most optimistic projections. The blitzkrieg that crushed Poland and France now devours the Soviet Union. Except in a few places. In a few strange, impossible places, the advance stops cold. Near Raseiniai, Lithuania. June 24th. A single KV-1 tank rolls onto a narrow road connecting German supply lines to the front. The crew is young, poorly trained, probably terrified. They position the tank at a crossroads and wait. Within hours, a German column approaches. Trucks loaded with ammunition, fuel, rations. Everything a Panzer division needs to keep moving east. The KV-1 opens fire. The first truck explodes. The column halts, trapped on the narrow road with swampland on both sides. Panic spreads as more vehicles burn. German infantry deploy, expecting a quick kill. They have seen Soviet tanks before. Thin armor, poor crews, machines that die easily. They bring up a 37mm anti-tank gun, the standard weapon that shredded Polish and French armor. They fire. The shell strikes the KV-1's frontal plate and ricochets into the trees. They fire again, same result. The sound is wrong. Not the crunch of penetration, but the sharp crack of deflection. The KV-1 rotates its turret slowly, deliberately. The 76mm gun roars. The anti-tank gun and its crew vanish in a spray of dirt and metal. Radio calls go out. A Panzer unit diverts to deal with this obstruction. 3 Panzer IIIs arrive, confident. Their 50mm guns have proven effective against every Soviet tank encountered so far. They maneuver for flank shots, trying to hit weaker side armor. They fire at ranges where they cannot miss. Shells strike home and bounce. The KV-1's side armor is thicker than most tanks' frontal plates. One Panzer commander watches his armor-piercing round ricochet skyward and realizes with cold clarity that he is fighting something new, something his tank was never designed to kill. The KV-1 swivels and fires. One Panzer brews up instantly, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. The other 2 retreat, crews shouting into radios that their weapons are ineffective. The word spreads through German units like a virus. Ineffective, useless, bouncing like pebbles. For soldiers who have spent 2 years watching their guns slice through enemy armor, this is incomprehensible, terrifying. The siege begins. The single KV-1 holds the crossroads for a full day. German forces cannot advance, cannot resupply forward units, cannot simply ignore a tank that commands the only usable road. They bring up more anti-tank guns, heavier ones. Shells slam into the KV-1 from multiple angles. Some penetrate the tracks, immobilizing the beast. But the hull remains intact. The turret still rotates. The gun still fires. Inside, the Soviet crew endures hell, deafening impacts, smoke, heat, dwindling ammunition. They cannot see much through the narrow vision slits. They do not know they are holding up an entire German division. They only know they are still alive, and the armor has not broken. Night falls. German combat engineers crawl forward under cover of darkness, dragging satchel charges. They reach the tank and place explosives against the tracks and rear armor. The charges detonate. The KV-1 shudders, but does not die. Dawn comes. The tank still sits at the crossroads, battered, scorched, but unbroken. Only when German forces bring up an 88mm anti-aircraft gun, a weapon designed to destroy bombers at high altitude, do they finally penetrate the armor at close range. The crew is found dead inside, surrounded by spent shell casings. They had fought until their ammunition ran out, then stayed at their posts even as the end closed in. This is not an isolated incident. Across the front, KV-1 tanks shatter German expectations. At Dubno, a KV-1 survives hits from multiple Panzers and destroys 7 German tanks before withdrawing. Near Minsk, a single KV-1 blocks a bridge for 6 hours, burning supply trucks and forcing an entire regiment to find another route. German after-action reports fill with phrases never before used: impenetrable, invulnerable, immune to standard weapons. Panzer crews who have felt invincible since Poland now experience something Soviet tankers have felt for years: the terror of facing an enemy your weapons cannot harm. Wehrmacht intelligence scrambles to understand what they are facing. Interrogations of captured Soviet crews reveal the designation Kliment Voroshilov, KV-1. Specifications are compiled, weaknesses analyzed. But analysis does not stop shells from bouncing. Knowledge does not make the killing easier. For the first time in the war, German armored units encounter a tank they must avoid rather than engage. Tactical doctrines written for fighting light and medium tanks become obsolete overnight. The standing order becomes: do not engage KV-1 frontally. Use 88mm guns when available. Call for air support. Attempt flanking only with superior numbers. The psychological impact is profound. German soldiers have been taught they possess superior equipment, superior training, superior doctrine. The early weeks of Barbarossa confirm this belief as Soviet units collapse in chaos. But the KV-1 introduces doubt. If Soviet engineering can produce this monster, what else might emerge? If their armor can stop our shells, how do we win? The invincibility complex that carried the Wehrmacht across Europe begins to crack. Not everywhere, not decisively, but enough. Enough that some Panzer crews hesitate before advancing. Enough that some commanders request additional support before attacking. Enough that the word spreads in whispers around campfires. The Soviets have a tank we cannot kill. The KV-1 was a fortress, but fortresses do not advance. And in the chaos of 1941, that distinction meant everything. Across the Western Soviet Union, KV-1s sat abandoned along roadsides, in fields, beside bridges that had collapsed beneath them, not destroyed by German fire, not knocked out by 88mm guns. Simply dead. Transmissions seized. Engines overheated beyond repair. Fuel tanks empty with no resupply column in sight. Crews stood beside 43 tons of invincible steel, helpless, watching German columns bypass them in the distance. Some tried to destroy their own tanks before retreating on foot. Others simply walked away, leaving the hatches open, the guns silent. The weight that made the KV-1 unstoppable also made it unbearable. Bridges rated for 30 tons buckled and snapped. Wooden crossings splintered. Fords that light tanks crossed easily became impassable mud traps. Recovery vehicles could not tow a dead KV-1. If it stopped moving, it stayed where it died. And in the headlong retreat of summer 1941, there was no time to stop, no time to repair, no time to wait for spare parts that did not exist. Crews learned to dread the sound of grinding metal from the transmission. That noise meant hours, maybe minutes, before total failure. Drivers pushed engines past safe limits, knowing the alternative was capture or death. Mechanics performed miracles with improvised parts, but miracles only stretch so far. For every KV-1 that held a crossroads and became legend, 3 more died silently in the rear, victims of their own mass. And the Germans adapted. They always adapted. After the first shock wore off, after the panic subsided and the reports consolidated, Wehrmacht commanders did what they did best. They solved the problem. 88mm flak guns, originally designed to shoot down aircraft, were retasked as tank destroyers. Their high-velocity shells could penetrate KV-1 armor at range. Not easily, not always, but enough. Doctrine changed. When a KV-1 appeared, units called for 88s, coordinated attacks, air support. They stopped trying to fight it fairly. German tank crews learned to bait the KV-1, to draw its fire and reveal its position, then withdraw while 88s maneuvered into flanking shots. They used terrain, used buildings, used patience. The KV-1's poor visibility became a liability. Its slow turret traverse meant a tank to one side could survive long enough to escape. Crews inside heard impacts, felt the tank shudder, but could not see where the next shot would come from. At Leningrad, at Moscow, in the desperate autumn battles, KV-1s fought until their barrels glowed red. They anchored defensive lines, covered retreats, bought time measured in hours and lives. But the invincibility was gone. German gunners knew where to aim now. They knew the weak points, lower hull, turret ring, rear engine deck. They knew that if you hit it enough times, even the KV-1 would burn. Soviet crews still trusted the armor. They had no choice. When a German tank appeared, they knew their frontal plate could take the hit. That confidence kept them fighting when others would have fled. But confidence does not repair a broken transmission. It does not summon fuel from an empty tank. It does not make a 43-ton machine move faster through a swamp. By the winter of 1941, the KV-1 was still feared, still dangerous, still capable of holding ground no other tank could hold. But it was no longer the nightmare that had stopped Panzers cold in June. The Germans had learned, they had adapted. And the Soviets had learned something too. Armor alone was not enough. The T-34, lighter and faster, became the backbone of Soviet armored forces. It could be produced in greater numbers, repaired more easily, transported without collapsing bridges. It was not invincible, but it was everywhere. And in a war of attrition, everywhere mattered more than invincible. Still, the KV-1 served. It fought at Stalingrad, at Kursk, in the long grinding battles that broke the Wehrmacht. Crews who survived learned to love and hate it in equal measure. Love the armor that kept them alive. Hate the weight that made every movement a struggle. They painted names on the turrets, kept photographs inside the cramped interiors, whispered promises to the steel that had saved them. In the factories, engineers worked on improvements, lighter transmissions, more powerful engines, better visibility. But the war moved faster than design schedules. By the time solutions appeared, the battlefield had changed again. The KV-1 became a relic of 1941, a symbol of a desperate moment when survival mattered more than speed, when one engineer's radical idea had been the only thing standing between the Red Army and annihilation. Kotin watched his creation fade from prominence. He did not mourn. He had built what was needed when it was needed. The KV-1 had bought time. Time for factories to evacuate east. Time for new designs to enter production. Time for the Soviet Union to survive the first terrible months and begin the long road back. In German war diaries, in after-action reports, in the quiet conversations of Panzer crews, the KV-1 remained a ghost. The tank that should not have existed. The fortress that moved. The machine that taught the Wehrmacht that invincibility could belong to the other side. The KV-1's true legacy wasn't measured in kill counts or battles won. It was measured in the fear it planted and the revolution it forced. In Berlin, German engineers pored over intelligence reports with growing alarm. Photographs of KV-1s, measurements of armor thickness, diagrams of welded construction, all laid bare on conference tables. The conclusions were unavoidable. Germany's existing tank designs were obsolete before the war was half a year old. The Panzer III and IV, Machines that had crushed Poland and France were suddenly inadequate. Soviet heavy armor had rewritten the rules, and Germany had no answer. Development programs accelerated with desperate urgency. The Tiger tank, already in early design phases, received immediate priority and funding. Specifications changed. Armor had to be thicker, guns had to be larger, protection had to match or exceed what the Soviets fielded. Meetings that once focused on mobility and operational range now obsessed over frontal armor angles and penetration tables. The Panther program followed similar logic. Both tanks traced their conceptual DNA directly back to encounters with the KV-1. German tankers who survived those early engagements demanded machines that wouldn't leave them helpless. High command listened because the alternative was unthinkable, sending crews into battle against enemies their weapons couldn't harm. Across the Atlantic, American and British intelligence officers studied the same reports. Tank development committees in Detroit and Birmingham revised their own priorities. The Sherman, already in production, suddenly seemed lighter than ideal. Debates erupted over whether to pursue heavier designs or rely on numerical superiority. The KV-1 hadn't fought Western tanks, but its existence alone shifted strategic calculations. Every nation with armored forces now understood that thickness and protection could dominate battlefields in ways speed alone could not. Inside the Soviet Union, Kotin and his team absorbed hard lessons. The KV-1 proved that armor worked. Shells bounced, crews survived hits that would have killed them in lighter machines. But it also proved that armor alone was not enough. A tank immobilized by its own weight was just an expensive pillbox. A fortress that couldn't reach the battlefield served no purpose. Reliability mattered as much as protection. Mobility couldn't be sacrificed entirely for thickness. The T-34 embodied that balance. Decent armor, excellent mobility, simple enough to produce in staggering numbers and maintain under brutal conditions. It became the war's most produced tank, not because it was invincible, but because it was good enough in all the ways that mattered. Yet the T-34's success rested on foundations the KV-1 laid. Before Kotin's radical welded armor scheme, Soviet doctrine accepted that tanks were fragile, that losses were inevitable, that survival was luck. The KV-1 shattered that fatalism. It demonstrated that engineering could create protection, that crews didn't have to die in thin steel boxes, that armor could be a weapon in itself. Every subsequent Soviet heavy tank, the IS-1, IS-2, IS-3, descended from Kotin's refusal to compromise on protection. The lineage was direct and undeniable. In post-war archives, German after-action reports preserve the terror in clinical language. Engagement inadvisable at standard combat ranges. Frontal assault not recommended without air support. Penetration achieved only with 88 mm at close range. Between the lines lived the reality. Panzer crews who watched their best shots ricochet harmlessly, who felt their confidence shatter along with their shells, who learned that invincibility could belong to the enemy. The psychological impact outlasted the tactical one. Even after Germany fielded Tigers and Panthers, even after the KV-1 faded from frontline service, its ghost haunted German armor doctrine. The memory of those first encounters, of helplessness against Soviet steel, never fully disappeared. Kotin's rejected idea, the armor scheme dismissed as too heavy, too radical, too impractical, became the blueprint every nation studied. His stubbornness, his refusal to accept that protection had limits, created a standard the world spent years trying to match. The KV-1 was never the perfect tank. It broke down too often, moved too slowly, demanded too much from its crews and its logistics. But for a brief, brutal period in 1941, it was exactly what the Soviet Union needed, a fortress on tracks that bought time with its armor when time was the only currency that mattered. One engineer refused to compromise, and for that refusal, his creation became immortal. The KV-1 was never the perfect tank. It broke down more often than it should have. It crushed bridges and exhausted crews. It was too heavy, too slow, too difficult to maintain. But in the summer of 1941, when the Soviet Union stood on the edge of collapse, perfection didn't matter. Survival did. And for a few desperate months, Kotin's rejected idea, the armor scheme dismissed as impossible, the welded fortress his superiors called impractical, became the machine that taught the Wehrmacht they could bleed. One engineer refused to compromise. He believed armor could save lives when everyone else prioritized speed and cost. He was right. The KV-1 didn't win the war. But it bought time. Time for factories to evacuate east. Time for new crews to train. Time for the Soviet Union to find its footing and fight back. Sometimes that's all a weapon needs to do. Hold the line long enough for others to arrive. If this story of stubborn conviction and battlefield terror resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. We bring you a new untold chapter from history every single day. Stories of the machines, the moments, and the people who changed everything. And drop a like if you believe the KV-1 deserves its place among the legendary tanks of World War II. Until tomorrow, remember this. The ideas others reject might be the ones that change the world. Sometimes the fortress that saves you is the one nobody wanted to build.